want to welcome everyone over here. I'm Magda Tedder. I'm the Schwidler Chair in Judaic Studies at Fordham University. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to this, I guess, fourth this semester lecture series of our lecture in our Fordham-NYPL lecture series in Jewish Studies. Which showcases research done by fellows in our Fordham-NYPL fellowship program, which we have been running jointly since 2017. Wow. Over the years, the program has brought to Fordham and the NYPL I think now almost 30 scholars from around the world, 4 continents, from North America, South America, Europe, and Asia, as far as Argentina, France, to Israel, Poland, and of course, many places across the United States. This year, you may have heard talks by Nick Underwood, who spoke about Yiddish as a Zionist language in post-war France, Rivka Elitzur-Lehman, who spoke about a early 20th century collection of late antique Jewish amulets that are found at the New York Public Library. And just last week, Marilyn Miller, who shared with us her work on Jose Marti, the Cuban independence fighter, and his Jewish supporters. I want to thank the NYPL and especially the Rod Jewish Division for helping this partnership flourish and for really helping us bring so many interesting, wonderful scholars to New York. I'm grateful to the Advisory Council and many of our friends of the Center for their generosity. Without their generosity, we couldn't run these programs, any of our programs. The fellowship program has been funded by the Pickett Family Foundation, and this year, the Knapp Family Foundation, which time has allowed us to bring a scholar for a full year, and that's why we have Shachar. We've had Shachar the whole year with us. Before I introduce Shachar, I want to express my gratitude also to Shavan Verletza, who's been working tirelessly on behalf of the center and for our in-person event, making sure we eat wonderful, tasty, kosher food, different every time so we don't repeat. And is responsible for many other things that we help us run the center. And I also want to thank my co-director, Sarit Katan-Gribitz. She's been an amazing partner co-directing the center and the program. Now let me introduce our speaker, Shachar Pinsker. Shachar is no stranger to Fordham. A few years ago, I think in 2018, back when his book came, he came to speak to us about his wonderful book, A Rich Brew, How Cafés Created Modern Jewish Culture. And this year, he has led a Hebrew literature reading group here at Fordham, which met both in the fall semester and in the early parts of the spring semester. Shachar is currently the Fordham-NYPL fellow at the New York Public Library, but his full-time position is a professor of Judaic Studies and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Michigan. Shachar is the author of 2 award-winning books. I already mentioned Rich Brew, but his first book was Literary Passports, The Making of Modernist Hebrew Fiction in Europe. And he is the co-editor of Hebrew Gender and Modernity, which came out in 2007, Women's Hebrew Poetry on American Shores, which came out in 2016, and Where the Sky and the Sea Meet, Israeli Yiddish stories, which came out from Magnes Press, I assume in Hebrew, in 2023. He's currently writing a book on Yiddish and Israeli literature and is co-directing the NEH-supported research project, the Feuilleton, the Public Sphere and Modern Jewish Cultures. Before I turn over the podium to Shachar, I just want to invite you to our program tomorrow here at the Lincoln Center campus, a lunch talk and conversation with writer Maya Arad, who has been described by the Israeli newspaper Haaretz as the finest living author writing in Hebrew. Arad will lead a conversation about the recently published translation of her book, The Hebrew Teacher, which many of us were reading in Hebrew here a few years ago when it came out in Israel. And on Wednesday, April 17th at 4 p.m., we will host a webinar just in time for Passover about the Shoah in Kibbutz Haggadot with Holis Granov Landauer, who has given a wonderful talk last year at this time about Kibbutz Haggadot, the non-traditional Kibbutz Haggadot. And finally, I want to say that we just almost finished installing an exhibit at the Rose Hill campus on the Passover Seder as told through our collection of Haggadot. And the exhibit has been curated by our first-year student at Fordham, Miriam Krakowski, and it's a really wonderful manifestation of both how wonderful our students are, but also highlighting our great collection of Haggadot. So now, without further ado, Shachar, the floor is yours. Slides.
Okay, thank you so much, Magda, for this wonderful introduction. And just before I start, I want to say, for reasons that we don't have to get into, maybe I'll talk about it towards the end. This has been a challenging year, but at the same time, it was a very rewarding and productive year. And I really need to thank Magda Teter and Sarit Katan-Gribetz and Shioban Verlize at Fordham University. I have to say, I'm really in awe. I'm coming from Michigan, where we have a big program with a lot of people. I'm really in awe with everything that you are doing here at Fordham, the richness of the activities and the teaching, which I only saw a little bit, but really very impressive. I'm also so fortunate to be a fellow this year at the New York Public Library, and I want to thank Ludmila Shokholova, Amanda Siegel, Jean, and all the other incredible Dorot people at the Dorot Jewish Division. Many of the materials I will talk about today, I was really only able to find because of the incredible collection that we have, and really piece together materials that you find in different places around the world, but they really helped me to bring them together, and really everybody at the New York Public Library. It's a great project. I also want to thank those people who participated in the Hebrew reading group. Some of them are here. I learned a lot from the group, from reading materials in Hebrew that is related to Yiddish and the contact between the languages, and I'll talk about it a little bit. I want to thank all of you who came here and joined us either in person or on Zoom, and The last thing I want to express is really to fellow scholars and translators of Yiddish. Also, some of them are sitting here or at home on Zoom. It's really a wonderful community of people, and especially in this challenging year, people really helped each other to translate materials, to put together materials. And last thing is to all the Yiddish writers and poets and editors and scholars with whom I was fortunate to meet. Some of them I'm going to speak about, and many of them are no longer with us. So this is one example, and I'm going to start with him. So in the 1980s, the bilingual writer Yossel Birstein wrote a collection of short stories published in Yiddish with the title Deine Geselach Yerushalayim, Your Street Jerusalem, and in Hebrew, the same stories with a different title called Ketem Shel Sheket, A Drop of Silence. One of these stories starts with the following reflection by the narrator. I've been told that I belong in the past. I speak about old people, and after many years in Israel, I continue to write Yiddish, a silent or deaf-mute language which no one speaks or hears anymore. No one told me this directly. I overheard people when they spoke about me, and I agreed with them. I could have added that I'm upset when I'm disappointed with a page I wrote in Yiddish. But what there is to be upset about? Words that no one will read or hear? But anyway, I continue to sweat and walk on things that don't exist anymore. So I guess I really belong in the past. In order not to be lonely there, I went to look for other people like me. This passage illustrates the perception of Yiddish in Israel as the language of the past, associated not only with old people, but also with exile, destruction, and death. This leads the narrator to present Yiddish as a silent or deaf-mute language, safach ereshet tilemet, because no one speaks or hears it. However, this is also a highly ironic text with multiple levels of meaning. From a historical perspective, the assertion that Yiddish is a silent language is a reversal of the long-term status of Yiddish as a widespread Jewish vernacular, spoken by around 80% of the world Jewish population at the beginning of the 20th century. After the Holocaust, or the Churban, as it was known in Yiddish, the language began to be preserved in books, anthologies, libraries, and archives. But is it true that Yiddish was a silent language in Palestine and later on in Israel? After all, the characters in Birstein's stories and novels are speakers of Yiddish, and they are far from being silent. In fact, the stories are full of the noise of spoken Yiddish. If this is the case, what makes Yiddish silent? Is it that mainstream Israeli culture silenced Yiddish and very few people could hear it? Does Birstein adopt or ironically expose the common perception of Yiddish in Israeli culture? Furthermore, what conclusion does Birstein infer from the assertion that Yiddish is a silent language? He writes with more than a pinch of irony that he cannot stop writing it because he really belongs in the past and he finds others like him. But what is the past? What does it mean to be there? How far does Birstein need to go in order to find Yiddish? In some sense, Birstein needed to go far, but also very near. Not only did he speak and write Yiddish, but he was also one of those who created a Yiddish cultural center in Israel in the 50s and 60s. For the rest of his life, Birstein continued to publish in Yiddish and to be active on the border zone between the languages. Even when he became a popular Hebrew writer, which is actually when I met him in the 80s and 90s, one could easily identify the Yiddish that lurks behind his Hebrew text on every level. So at first glance, these questions that the story raised might seem idiosyncratic to a bilingual Yiddish-Hebrew Israeli writer like Birstein. Nevertheless, I argue that they are central, not only to understand Yiddish after the Churban, but also these questions are at the heart of the notion of Israeliness and what does it mean, the culture of Israel. These questions have a political dimension as well, which I believe is more important at a current moment after everything that happened since October 7th, the war and devastation in Gaza, and the uncertainty about the future. So, both before and after the establishment of the state, mainstream ideology has privileged Hebrew, of course. Hebrew was the language most associated with Zionist nationalism, and scholars have assumed Israeli culture to be monolingual and conflated it with Hebrew. But this is problematic. Why? First, it assumes a direct continuity between the transnational diasporic Hebrew culture that was created in Eastern and Central Europe, in America, in the Middle East, and what was created in Israel. But even more important, it elides the multilingual cultural reality in Israel, Palestine. In recent years, scholars turned their attention to the multiplicity of languages in which cultural products were and still are produced. They have explored Arabic, English, German, Russian, French, Polish, and the relationship between these languages and Hebrew. So my work contributes to this growing field by examining the role of Yiddish in Israeli culture, a topic that for several reasons have not attracted much scholarly attention until recent years, but this is changing now with the work of people such as my own teacher, Hannah Kronfeld, and the work of people like David Roski, Savrom Noverstern, Yael Chaver, Yad Biran, Benny Mer, Rachel Rozhansky, Gali Drucker-Baram, and other people. So now, after many years that people thought, okay, what there is there to study about Yiddish in Israel, now there's a group of us working on different aspects. So the study of Yiddish in Israeli culture includes a large corpus created in Yiddish, as well as translations from Yiddish into Hebrew. There is also a significant body of literature created in Hebrew by writers such as, and I'm just going to go quickly and show you a few examples, even though we don't have time to talk about them. Avot Yeshurun, whose original name is Yechiel Perlmutter, the great poet, who of course wrote in Hebrew, but here is a Yiddish letter, and my student from Michigan who did a PhD with us just recently published a wonderful book of the letters with his family in Yiddish and how it came into his poetry. But this is true also for very well-known writers like Aaron Erwin Appelfeld, who is a Holocaust survivor and came to Israel, became a Hebrew writer, but he studied Yiddish at the Hebrew University with Dov Sadan. His father that he kind of adopted was the Yiddish writer Leib Brochman, and Yiddish really influenced his writing in many ways. This is also true for Yehudit Handel and those people who were with me in the Hebrew group. We read a lot of these texts together, who Yehudit Handel was one of the very few women in the group that is known as kind of the Sabra 1948 generation, and she wrote stories like there are different people, maybe we'll get back to it later, about Yiddish speakers, Holocaust survivors, and refugees who came to Israel in the early years. But this is also true for people like Aaron Meged, who in the 80s wrote a novel called Feuilleton about a Yiddish poet. It's true for people like Yaakov Shabtai, whom you see here as kind of like the poster picture of the Sabra, but he was also translating materials from Sholem Aleichem and from other Yiddish writers, and also Yiddish plays an important role in his own Hebrew writing, and maybe finally to David Grossman, and we read together with a Hebrew group something from the novel Ayene Rechava, See Under Love, where Yiddish really plays a very important role. So, due to the historical circumstances of Yiddish after the Churban, and I use the word Churban here instead of the Holocaust, because it's important from the point of view of Yiddish speakers, that's the term that they use. All of these texts, whether they're written in Yiddish or in Hebrew, they invoke questions about what Jeffrey Chandler identified as post-vernacular culture, a situation in which symbolic significance is carried by the language apart from the semantic content of utterances. Not surprisingly, Yiddish writers were preoccupied with the relationship between Yiddish and Hebrew and dealt with images of Yiddish as a mameloshen, as a mother tongue, thus challenging what Yasmin Yildiz called the monolingual paradigm, in which individuals are imagined possessing one true language only, the mother tongue, and through this possession to be organically linked to an exclusive, clearly demarcated ethnicity, culture, and nation. And I'm not going to have time really to talk about her, but I just wanted to mention here in this context the wonderful poet Rivka Basman Ben Chaim, who just passed away last year. And I also had a really wonderful chance to meet her. And you can see that in one of her poem in Stilkeit, she writes about, in silence I speak Yiddish, de profundis. By day, it's easier to speak Hebrew. So these people were multilingual. She knew Hebrew very well, but she continued to write Yiddish poetry only in Yiddish until the end of her life. So this is a large topic, obviously, just with the examples that I gave until now. So the question is where and when to begin, right? Locating a point of origin, to speak specifically about Yiddish writing, Yiddish literature, Yiddish culture in Israel is somewhat arbitrary and problematic, but let me suggest this. Avram Sutzkever and his poem Yiddish. Okay, this is Avram Sutzkever, and we'll get in a second to the poem called Simply Yiddish. That's a good starting point. Why? Not only because it was written in 1948, just when the State of Israel was established and in the middle of the war, in the first collection that Sutzkever wrote after he arrived in the country, in Fire Vogen, in the Chariot of Fire, but also because it interrogates the very question of beginning. So here's the poem. You can see it in Yiddish and in Hebrew. I know there's some people here who can read the Yiddish very well. I'm just going to read the first few lines, and then we'll focus on the the English translation, which was done by Benjamin and Barbara Arshav. And you'll hear that Benjamin Arshav is also a very important figure as a Yiddish poet himself, and as a translator, and as a scholar. So this is how the poem begins. Soll ich onheuben von onheib, soll ich wie Avrom us Bruderschaft zerhacken alle Getzen, soll ich sich lebendigen losen übersetzen, soll ich anfleizen mei Zung und warten bin verlanden, wot sie sich avosdike Rojinkes mit Mandeln, and so on. Shall I start from the beginning? Shall I, like Abraham, smash all the idols? Shall I let myself be translated alive? Shall I plant my tongue and wait till it transforms into our forefathers' raisins and almonds? What kind of a joke preaches my poetry brother with whiskers that soon my mother tongue will set forever? 100 years from now, we still may sit here on the Jordan and carry on this argument, for a question gnaws and paws in me. If he knows exactly in what regions Levi Yitzchok prayer, Yehoash poem, Kulbak song are straying to the sunset, could he please show me where the language will go down? Maybe at the Wailing Wall. If so, I shall come there, come open my mouth, and like a lion garbed in fiery scarlet, I shall swallow the language as it sets and wake all the generation with my roar. Okay, very dramatic poem. But before we get to the drama, I'm not gonna do a lot of close reading, but just this particular poem, because I think it's really like the question and what he raises is really important. So this is a poem full of questions. It's written in a tense dialogue with an addressee, either a real or imaginary Israeli, perhaps even an established Hebrew poet, who posed to a Yiddish poet, newly arrived in the country, the question of why? Why? Why write in Yiddish? Why in Israel? Is there any future for Yiddish in Israel? Now, when the speaker gives an answer, he does it in a very particular Yiddish mode of answering a question with a question, right? And he begins with Bereshit. He begins with Genesis, right? This is hardly surprising because Sutzkever often employed network of images derived from the Bible to deal with major themes, issues of traumatic memory, how to come to terms with the Churban, how to achieve continuity and renewal. but we should also be attuned to the subtle ways in which Sutzkever invoke Genesis. He insists here on using the Yiddish word onheib and not bereshis, the Hebrew word. Why? Onheib actually was widely used in the early 20th century as a title for Yiddish modernist journal, books and publish houses. Actually, in August 1928, a group of writers published Onheib, the first Palestinian collection of Yiddish literature. Also, the poet and translator Yehoash, Solomon Blumgarden, used the same spelling Onheib, you can see here, in Honheib, not in Bereshis, to begin his Yiddish translation of the Bible in the same time. The word and its spelling connect the land of Israel, Palestine, Eretz Israel, and the Bible with Yiddish itself, and indicate the existence of a significant body of Palestinian Yiddish literature before 1948, which is not a moment of continuity as much as rupture. And since I mentioned that, I also want to make sure that everybody knows here that if you go to EVO, in the Center for Jewish History, there's a wonderful small exhibition about Palestinian Yiddish, which we should all see, because it's really fascinating and beautiful exhibition. So, considering the question about beginnings and the difficulty, I'm going to go back to the poem so you can see, follow along with me. The difficulty in locating a point of origin in the poem, it is not surprising that the next line moves not to the biblical Adam, the first human being, but to Abraham, the father of the nation, which is of course the poet's first name, Avram Sutzkever. When God commands Abraham, Lech lecha, get thee out of your country in Genesis, he is asked to make a clear break with the past and a fresh start in the new land. According to the Midrash, to which the poem alludes, Abraham not only crosses the Jordan and leaves his father's house behind him, but also smashes the idols, not merely departing, but destroying his father's past. So I understand the lines, shall I, like Abraham, out of brotherhood, smash all the idols, as referring to the cultural hegemonic ideology of Shlilat HaGalut, the negation of exile, cutting off the relation with the Jewish diaspora and with Yiddish, which is the Ashkenazi diasporic language. So the speaker asks, is Yiddish considered an idol that one needs to smash in order to become a good Israeli? This rhetorical question shows Sutzkever's defiance of monolingualism and also of the ideology of the negation of exile as prerogative of Israeli cultural identity. This defiance continues when he writes, Zol ich sich alebediken losem, shall I let myself be translated alive? Now this question seems surprising because of the implied equation of translation with death. But why? What is wrong with being translated? After all, most writers and poets are delighted to be translated due to the opportunity to reach new audiences in other languages. But here the place of Yiddish in the new state of Israel make translation a thorny issue. For Sutzkever and for other Yiddish writers, the danger of being alive only through translation is all too real. And this is evidence from responses to attempts to publish new works and new forums for Yiddish literature in the young state of Israel. For example, the Hebrew writer and critic Shin Yud Pnueli wrote that he didn't understand the need for a Yiddish journal in Israel. Yiddish, he wrote, quote, is one language of one Jewish diaspora, not the golden chain of our culture. The poem of Hey Levi and Leah Les, he exclaimed, belong in New York, and if they should be published in Israel at all, it should be done in Hebrew translation for the Hebrew Israeli reader. Okay? So the refusal to exist only in translation is linked to the danger that Yiddish will become a hallowed monument to the past, which is something that central Israeli figures, such as the writer and editor Aaron Meget, claimed, even though he was very sympathetic to Yiddish, but he thought, okay, Yiddish belongs to the past. What we should do is really just translate the important Yiddish text into Hebrew. And Sutzkever was, no way, this is not what we are doing. Okay? So when the speaker ask, shall I plant my tongue and wait until it transforms into our forefathers' raisins and almonds? What kind of a joke preaches my poetry brother with whiskers that soon my mother tongue will set forever? He raises the question of how his own Yiddish poetic tongue could be preserved and understood in this new environment. Is Yiddish a mameloshen, a mother tongue that is about to disappear? Is it going to turn into the forefathers, raisins, and almonds? Sutzkever illustrates here various perceptions of Yiddish in Israel, either as a mameloshen with the gender assumption of kind of maternal language, as a language suited only for nostalgic songs like Rojinkes mit Mandlen, the almonds, right? And or as a humorous language that is being used only for jokes or comic relief, right? Like whiskers added to a portrait. For the speaker in the poem, Yiddish is neither funny nor nostalgic. Moreover, it is not going to disappear despite the murder of so many of its native speakers in Europe and its suppression in Israel and in other places around the world. He predicts that even 100 years from now, Yiddish will not die, but instead, we will continue to sit on the Jordan, this liminal side of the river that separates the land of Israel, Palestine, and the diaspora, and carry on the discussion about Jewish languages. What is most significant for the speaker is not whether Yiddish will enjoy a national status in the state. Rather, it is the issue of cultural continuation and the lineage that links, for example, people like the Hasidic Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Perditchev, and then from there to Yehoash, which I already mentioned, who was a wonderful poet and also translated the Bible into Yiddish, and from there to Moshe Kulbach, the modernist Yiddish poet and writer who was born in Smorgon, the same town near Vilna, where Sutzkever himself was born, and who was an inspiration for the young Vilna group to which Sutzkever belonged and began his literary career. So towards the end of the poem, there is the question, where, the speaker asks, will this tradition of modern Yiddish literature go? Maybe to the Wailing Wall, to the Kotel Ma'aravi, the site most associated with traditional Jewish memory, but whose territory was now in question during the 1948 war. He wrote it in the middle of the war. If this is where Yiddish will go, then I shall come, say the speaker, I shall come there, come open my mouth, and like a lion garbed in fiery scarlet, I shall swallow the language as it sets and wake all the generation with my roar. At the end of this powerful poem, the speaker hijacks devices from the prophetic mode, associated mostly with the Hebrew poetry of Chaim Nachman Bialik, the roaring lion, the fiery scarlet garment, the language itself, which he devours and swallows like Jeremiah, the prophet. But unlike the prophet, the speaker does not seek fire to devour the people, but rather he himself seeks to devour the Yiddish word in a symbiosis between him and the language. Okay? So obviously, Sutzkever is the most well-known poet, and it used to be a commonplace to refer to Sutzkever as the last great Yiddish poet. However, I think we should really think of Sutzkever not as the last, but the first great Israeli Yiddish poet. Sutzkever, of course, became an embodiment of Yiddish, its literature and culture in Israel. He did so by writing and publishing Yiddish poetry after his death, until his death in 2010, and also by establishing and editing in 1949 the journal The Golden Decade, the Golden Chain, which became the most important post-Holocaust literary and cultural forum in the world. So against all odds, The Golden Decade was published not in New York, Montreal, or Buenos Aires, but in Tel Aviv, where Sutzkever even managed to get the support of the Histadrut, the General Organization of Workers in the land of Israel. So many people are familiar with the Golden Decade because it was really very important worldwide. But I want just to show you a few of the range of different journals and newspapers. Many of them are found in the New York Public Library and are very difficult to find elsewhere. From Illustrierte Wochenblatt, the Illustrated Weekly, that started in 1948 as a kind of very popular newspaper to really a range of newspapers from Nie Welt, and it's also a range in terms of the politics, because Nie Welt was the newspaper of the labor Zionist left, okay, Poalei Zion Small, okay, all the way to Letzte Nayes, which was kind of not affiliated with any political movement, and was edited by Tsanin and existed for many years, to Lebensfragen, which was the journal of the Bund. Now, we don't have time to talk about it, but maybe later on in the Q&A, you can ask me about it. I mean, it sounds like a contradiction, right? Because anyone who knows something about the Bund, they were non-Zionist, maybe even anti-Zionist. So suddenly you have Lebensfragen, a Bundist newspaper in Israel. Actually, it wasn't a contradiction for many Bundists who continued. And this continued for many years, right? There's even Frei Israel, which belongs to the Communist Party. And this is really interesting. And only the New York Public Library and the National Library has this newspaper. They publish newspaper in Hebrew, in Arabic, and in Yiddish. And there were a lot of connections between, which is really fascinating. And I only now start to find in these materials. Of course, apart from these newspapers, which are not just literary and culturals, there were also many, apart from the well-known, the Golden Decade, there were other journals like, or Sammlung that collected literature, some of them very early in 1949, Israel Schriften in 1956, and Hamish that continued later into the 70s and 80s. Right, and you know, from here I'm going to talk a little bit about this group that is called Young Israel. These newspapers and journals really ushered a new generation of Yiddish Israeli writers. This can be seen in this group, Young Israel, which was established in 1951 in Kibbutz Yagur, mostly of people from Sheris HaPleta or Sherit HaPleta, which are refugees and survivors of the Churban, of the Holocaust, who arrived around these years of 48 and mostly began their Yiddish literary activities in the country. Among them were Yosef Birstein that I mentioned, Zvi Eisenman, Rivka Bassman, I also mentioned, Avrom Rinzler, Hey Binyamin Arshav, Fishman, Mendelman, Avrom Karpinovich, and Moshe Jungman. Here's another picture from the meeting from 1954, where you can see the two women, Rivka Bassman and Rochel Fishman, among these people. And in the middle, you see Sutzkever. He was the kind of the father figure. Even though he was just a few years older than them, he was already established and well known, while they were really beginners. There were other writers, as well as artists like Yosef Bergner, who participated in group activities and published their works with them, either in the Golden Decade, in other publications, or in their own journal that didn't really exist for many years, but is really fascinating, just in the range of materials published there, also in the combination of artwork and literature. And they also had their own book series that continued throughout the 50s and 60s, and many of these people published their books in the book series. So in the meeting, on the pages of the journals and newspapers, they debated vigorously the reason to write in Yiddish, the direction which Israeli Yiddish writing should take. Young Israel illustrate the fact that Yiddish literature has effectively been silenced from the historiography of Israeli culture. And there is a task, a necessary task of bringing these voices back to the consciousness. People, of course, people who read Yiddish knew them very well, but the mainstream in Israel either didn't know them, or today these voices are much less well known. So this begs the question: how do we understand Israeli culture in a different way when we consider what was written in Yiddish by writers who were active in Palestine, Israel, and who wrote about it. So the last part of my lecture, I want to give, and really there's no time for that, to touch on everything because there's so many topics here, but I want to just touch on two short examples of prevalent concerns and themes in Israeli Yiddish writing. One is the trope of Israeli snow, which is common in several Yiddish,
It says there, הוצאה חד פעמית.
yeah.
Was it only once?
No, it wasn't. It wasn't. But this was very, I mean, we can talk about it in the Q&A, but this was very common actually in modernist journals all over the world. It's only once, and then it's twice, and then it's 3 times. But, you know, it's kind of, we can talk about it. It's a good question. Maybe we'll go back to it. Okay, so Israeli snow. This was a topic that was common in many Yiddish poems and stories and even novels, written mostly in the early years of the state, but actually all the way until today. Writing about snow is just one example of how Yiddish writers portrayed the landscape of Israel-Palestine in a way that exhibit their encounter with the country informed by the landscape of Europe before and during World War II, as well as by Yiddish literary vocabulary and motifs that were rooted in the shtetl and then later on in European and American and actually all over the world in the cities. Of course, snow, anyone who knows Israel knows that snow is a very rare occurrence in the country, right? It's limited to a small area in the country or to unusual winter storms. In the hands of Yiddish writers, Israeli snow emerges as a productive, albeit paradoxical trope for the literature. It shows the continuities and ruptures between the past and the present, between the Middle East and Europe, between the Jewish diaspora and a new Israeli society in the making, as well as various textual traditions that sometimes clash with each other and occasionally enable writers to find moments of commonality. So this can be seen again. I'm going to go back again to Sutz Covert and a wonderful poem, and I want us actually to hear it because we have a wonderful recording of Sutz Covert reads it in Yiddish. So hopefully you can hear it and then you can follow the English translation. Why did it disappear suddenly? No, not really. What?
We tested it.
We tested it before.
Well, I think restart.
I need to restart it. Okay, so okay, so as this restart, I'm going to talk about it. Okay.
You can close that slide like this. Yeah.
Close it.
Yeah, that's mine. Yeah.
Let's do it again here. Get to the place where we are now.
Der Schnee von Hermann. Mein Komaschmelon der Schnee, was so von Hermann oben. Antpflegt mir aber Schneete ordentliche Hatte, wenn begartelt mit der Säge und der Reih mein Tate, und die Sonne, was blonget in den Welt läuft die Scheiben, finkelt in sein Bord sein ungeeisigte in Hatte. Vermont mir an die Iden, was wie Schnee in Chlore, sind sie gefallen, stummer Heit der ganzen Winter, und sie liegen hinter meine schwarze Pläne hinter. Denken an das Frühling, soll sie machen das Tore. Nur ist dem Verein, als eine Frühling, als der Grinter. Vögel von dem Hermann, was ich hab geschlossen Kannschaft, noch in El Hatzipor mit ein harziger Negine. Bring a Schnee a kindischen und deine Flügeldinne, von mein Heim, der irgendwo ein, wird lieber sein die Landschaft. Ohne Schnee wird kalt sein in der flammiger Medine.
Okay. Yeah, I'm glad we were able to hear it. Okay. All right. So what is going on in this poem? You have here the English translation of Heather Valencia. Yeah, I mean he really sees the snow on Mount Hermon, which is really the only place in Israel where there is snow, maybe, okay, if you're lucky. And he asks about the meaning, Mai Kamashmalan, which is actually from the Mishnah and from the Talmud in Aramaic. What does this snow mean? Okay, this sudden vision of the snow on the mountain. The snow becomes, of course, a pretext for memory, for remembering the personal and collective past, and the link between East European landscapes and the landscape of Palestine, Israel. In the first stanza, Sutzkever speaker returns to his childhood in Siberia. Sutzkever, with his family, moved, they fled to Siberia in 1915, and it retained an aura of a place of childhood and security. Maybe it's not exactly what you associate with Siberia, but that's how it was for him. In the second stanza, the snow of Mount Hermon reminds the speaker the Jews who, like few flakes of snow, silently fell all winter long, referring, of course, to the devastation of the Jewish community of Vilna in the Churban. In the third and final stanza of the poem, the speaker explicitly invokes Bialik, El Tzipor, birds of Mount Hermon. It was in El Tzipor that I first met you and your joyful song. Bring me back some childhood snow upon your tiny wings, from my home, my Ir Va'em, the mother and city, and I will love this landscape more. Without that snow, it will be cold in this hot, fiery land. Now, in Bialik's Hebrew poem, the speaker is sitting at his home in the cold land. The poem was written in Zhytomyr in the Russian Empire, today in the Ukraine, begging the little bird that appears in the window to bring him songs from the warm land, the long after Zion, which is a place he knows only from traditional Jewish texts and prayer books from the Hebrew poem of the period. In Sutzkever poem, the bird that the speaker sees on Mount Hermon brings to his mind Bialik's bird, which he read as a child. But notably, Sutzkever's speaker asked the bird to bring him back some childhood snow from his home, from the mother and city, which is Jewish Vilna, that was destroyed in the war and existed in the memory of its people. However, this memory of the place was so real and vivid, perhaps even more than the new reality, or just as the new reality of Palestine, Israel, that he sees around him. For Sutzkever, the prospect of establishing a new home, depends on integrating memories of the diasporic East European Jewish past and experience. No matter how traumatic this memory became, the poet must create a landscape of memory. Otherwise, without the snow, he will be extremely cold in the hot, fiery land. I love this image. In contrast to the nationalist Israeli ideology of the negation of exile, according to which forgetting Yiddish and the diasporic Jewish culture is necessary to create Israeli identity, Sutzkever emphasizes golus, the Yiddish word for exile and diaspora, and wants to bring exile into the land. Another I move. All right. So yeah, just very quickly before we move on and I start to wrap the lecture, I want to mention Hey Binyamin Arushovsky Arshav, who wrote in 1950 a wonderful poem called Shnei in Yerushalayim. Sometimes there is snow in Jerusalem, and in 1950 there was a big snow. storm in Jerusalem. People still speak about it. And you know, this is a very different kind of poem than the one by Sutzkever. You know, if you look at it, Weiß Schnee, gut was bist gekommen. Okay, you know snow, it's good. This is the English translation of Hannah Kronfeld. You know snow, it's good that you've come. I've melted from longing for your succulent, succulent Yiddish language. My neighbors, the pointy cypresses, have long been pleading with the sky. The snows, the dawny snows, where are they? And here you're ours again. So the longing for snow is equated here with the succulent Yiddish language and then rhymed with the Israeli Hebrew trees, okay, the broshen, but with the Yiddish plural suffix. Okay, so brosh becomes broshen. The famously sharp Mediterranean cypress trees are waiting like the speaker for the soft snow. The three-way analogy that the poem makes between the speaker, the snow, and Yiddish becomes by the end of the poem an intimate encounter between them. And I read here from the very end of the poem, and in the English translation, you can tell snow, yes, the two of us are already on familiar terms, that the heat won't let you rest in the holy city. So before we melt away, let's escape together to some secret corner where no one will see us, where no one will follow us, and I will read to you my poems. The speaker here chooses the intimate language of Yiddish since the snow is reminiscence of other places from his childhood. He speaks with the snow in a familiar grammatic form as if they are close relatives or friends rather than acquaintances, and read to him the Yiddish poems that he wrote. But this reading can only take place in hiding, in sod. Why is that? In a place where no one will discover and ruin, maybe by ridicule, by mockery and derision, together with the fear of the influence of Yiddish. This was the common attitude toward what Yael Chaver called the language that must be forgotten. And yet, Hey Binyamin and his fellow writers not only wrote Israeli Yiddish poetry, but also used Yiddish to renew literature even in Hebrew, and there's a lot of interesting connection between this group and the people who wrote there with the very well-known group of Hebrew poetry, Likrat, which is really kind of the statehood generation of people like Natan Zach and you know many other Israeli well-known writers. The last example, and I'll end with this. I have about 10 more minutes. Sure. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, the last example I want to talk about, and this is maybe politically challenging, but I want to make sure that we at least touch on that. There is a corpus of text that I'm still thinking about, that really wrestle in Yiddish, written in Yiddish by some of these people, that wrestle with difficult and traumatic events that took place in Israel, Palestine during the period of the 1948 war and the mass migration of the 1950s. One such text is an article I just discovered this year recently. It was published in May 14th, 1948, which of course all of you who know the history, this was the day that Ben Gurion declared the establishment of the state of...
Say March 14 over there.
Says March? Yeah, that's a mistake. That's my mistake. Thanks. You see here, if you can see the Yiddish, it's May. Thanks for correcting it. It's May. So this is, I mean, he didn't know that, right? This was written by an older writer, Avrom Bloy, who also wrote Yiddish stories about Arab figures called arabesques. Okay, and the title of the article is "The Arabische Tragedia in Eretz Israel," the Arab tragedy in Palestine, Eretz Israel. It is a clear-eyed assessment of the present and the future, which actually makes it very relevant, I think, today. Here is just a little bit of what he wrote there. The newspaper brings almost every day an item about this or that Arab village that the Haganah seized and whose inhabitants escaped and took refuge. Not long ago, such a piece of news about an Arab village would receive a large headline in the newspaper and would be the talk of the day in the issue. Today, such events are already reported in the rubric of the small chronicle of events. Just a few lines, almost unnoticed by many, and it becomes unremarkable, a non-issue. It has become almost a common phenomenon. But when you think about the matter and see the picture as it is, you should be filled with horror. That is, if you are not obsessed with revenge, and if you don't see every Arab as a murderer from whom everything can be taken, if you can still see things from the pure and simple human point of view, the whole sad picture is revealed to you. And now more than 150,000 Palestinians, this is in May 1948, he didn't know the exact, how many people, are wandering in unfriendly foreign Arab cities, traveling on the road and sleeping with the beast of poverty, with which they are barely able to come to terms with during the wild run. And, we don't have time to talk about the entire article, but it has a really interesting analysis of what's going on with the British and with imperialism and, what he thinks would happen and could happen in 48. It's really incredible that he wrote it. Blay, who immigrated to Palestine earlier in the 1920s and lived both in Palestine and in America, wrote this during the 1948 war, which became, of course, in Hebrew, Milchemet HaShichrur or Milchemet HaAtzmaut, but from the point of view of the Palestinians, became the Nakba, the catastrophe, what really became for hundreds, thousands of people who became refugees. Now, several Yiddish texts, and I'm only able to really just touch on it in a few seconds, they really talk about what's going on. There are a number of texts that are written during the war when young people from Sheris HaPleita were thrown directly into the battles, into the 1948 war, as Gachal, Giyus Chutz La'aretz. So you can imagine people who are refugees and survivors, they go to DP camps, they come and they are fighting in the middle of the war, and some of them wrote about it. So, Hey Binyamin Arshav, we don't have time to talk about it, but he has an untitled poem called Somewhere High on a Stony Mountain, which he signs under that it took place in Beit Natif or Beit Natif in 1948. Here you can see a picture of people from the Haganah or the Palmach after the village was captured and emptied of its population. And I don't have time to read it. This is my own English translation, but I just want to point here where there is it starts with the soldier who is coming from far, far away from a land which is colder than cold, right? So this is about his own experience of coming from Europe and experiencing World War II, and then somewhere homeless dogs bark from a village which is no more village, okay? There isn't a lot that is explicit here, but I think he really wrestles with the question of vis-a-vis those Palestinians who used to live there, okay? There is this story that I translated and was published in recently. Vergesst nicht, don't forget, where the story is about it's a harrowing story, but it's an important story because it's about a soldier who comes from DP camps and thrown into the war and captures a Palestinian Arab and doesn't know what to do with it. And I'm not going to tell you exactly what happens, but he kills him in the end in a very violent way, and then he pulls himself and says, what have I done? What was the point of that? So this is another example of a text that was written from that point of view. There are other texts, and this is fascinating, but we don't have time to get into all the details, that are not about Yiddish writers who fought in the war, but those people who arrived just after the war, and there was no place for them to live. So where did they live? they lived in abandoned villages. You know, Kfarim Netushim or Rechut Shnatush in Hebrew, these are places that used to belong to Palestinians, and then they were empty during the war and were repopulated by new immigrants, both Holocaust survivors from Europe and people who came from Arab countries and, of course, had to flee the places. So Mendelman wrote many wonderful stories that very lucky that there is a translation into English as well, Seeds in the Desert, check it out, and a whole novel in an abandoned village in 1954 that was never translated into English, but maybe will soon, where really it is about the life of Holocaust survivors, especially the character Monye, who's a refugee, who comes and lives in Yazur. Yazur was an Arab village after 1948 and after it was emptied of its Arab population. The name was changed in Hebrew to Azur, but in the novel he keeps calling it the Mosque Hill. Okay, the Mosque Hill, and you can see here there's still a little bit of remains from the old mosque that used to be there. This is an incredible novel. Obviously, we don't have time to cover it, but it's really interesting that even though it's really all about the life of Monia and other Yiddish speaker refugees and Holocaust survivors, and actually goes back and forth in time between Palestine, Israel, in this period just after 48, and his life before the war, where he actually used to live in a village and actually do agriculture. Okay, and one of the most really interesting elements in the text is that these people who live there, they constantly think about who lived there before, and of course they don't see them because these people became refugees. But there is an incredible scene in the middle of the novel where suddenly they see an Arab person and they cannot communicate because they don't have the common language. They speak Yiddish, maybe they know Brew, and he speaks Arabic. And they gather around him and they say, "Who is this person?" And some are scared, some are, and then slowly they start to think, maybe this is someone who used to live here, and he tries to come back to his house. Now, I'm not saying that there's suddenly some kind of communication and common language, but what I find so fascinating is that in the middle of the novel, it immediately brings back the traumatic memory of these people during World War II. And they can see what Michael Rothberg and other people talking about, this kind of multi-directional memory, that this is not necessarily a kind of zero-sum game, but there's some connection between the trauma of people in the Holocaust and people in and the experience of people, both Jews and Arabs, traumatic experiences in 1948. I'm going to skip this just in terms of time. There is a wonderful story by Tzvi Eisenman called "Where the Sky and Earth Meet," and this became the title of the collection that Magda mentioned of Israeli stories. This story takes place in Jebelia, which is a neighborhood in Jaffa, again after 1948, when he was captured by the Etzel. Before the state of Israel was established, very quickly they changed the name from Jebelia to Givat Aliyah, which sounds very similar, but it's a very different meaning, right? I mean, Givat Aliyah, it's the hill of immigration, the word Aliyah in Hebrew. And Tzvi Eisenman has a wonderful story where the sky and earth meet that really takes place in there. And again, you see these refugees and survivors who live in this neighborhood, and they interact with Arabs and with other survivors, and also with Jews who come from Arab countries. Now, not many people know that, but in the time, this was actually seen by many people as a kind of shtetl, a little shtetl in the south of Tel Aviv. There was a Goldfaden theater was actually there, and it's really interesting to see everything that was written about it. There's a whole novel written by Yitzhak Perlov called Jebelia, which actually hasn't been announced officially, but I think I'm allowed to say that my colleague Yael Chaver, who might be on Zoom, and I will be translating this novel in the Yiddish Book Center as part of the translation fellowship program. And this is an incredible novel that takes place in Jebelia, in this Palestinian neighborhood in Jaffa. And really it's really fascinating because it's a kind of popular novel. It was published actually in the Forward here in New York in installment, and then later on he collected it and wrote a whole novel about it. It's a kind of family saga showing the 3 generations of a family, the Carlsbad family. It's actually it's a family that people didn't know where they are because they lost each other during the war. They didn't know whether people survived or not. Turned out that they all survived. The sons came before, and then Zechariah, the father, he's the last one to come, and then he finds his sons. Okay, and there's a really interesting. I mean, it's such a fascinating novel. But one thing that I do want to mention just very quickly is that when Zechariah, the father, comes, I'm gonna end with this. He talks to his son who fought in the war, right? And he talks about these Palestinian Arabs who actually lived outside Jebelia in the area that is Ajami today, for those of you who know Jaffa, and kind of half jokingly but half not, his son Azriel refers to it as the Arab ghetto. And Zechariah, the father, is shocked. He says, Arab ghetto? There is an Arab ghetto? He's horrified by it. And you know, there is a really interesting tension that goes there between the father and the son, which are both Holocaust survivors, right? But also we can see that the relationship between the Holocaust survivors, the Jews from Arab countries, and the Palestinians. So, in this lecture, I could only touch on a few examples of Yiddish literature and culture, but I think it is evident that in order to understand what was created, we need to consider what was written in other languages rather than Hebrew, such as Yiddish and also Arabic, and also maybe put Yiddish and Arabic side by side. We should also know that Yiddish literature in Israel-Palestine was transnational by definition. Yiddish journals and books produced in Israel were read not only by Israelis, but also by Jews everywhere. Yiddish writers in Israel-Palestine also published around the world and moved around the world in Paris, in New York, in South America, and were not confined to the Israeli borders. Yiddish writers in Israel fused the Middle Eastern landscape and characters with those of other places and times, summoning the Jewish and non-Jewish world outside, as well as the past. Finally, unlike the Israeli ethos of Mishoah leTkuma, that is developed, I think on kind of the idea of military might, Yiddish culture was invested in something different, a kind of multi-directional memory that takes the plight of the Jews that survived the Holocaust and those Jews that were uprooted from Arab countries side by side with those of Palestinians. So rethinking Yiddish literature and culture in Israel-Palestine in these terms, it's something that we can only maybe grasp now, even or perhaps precisely because we are in a time of crisis. And I want to point, and I'm just going to show you before I finish, some examples of this film by Danny Rosenberg, that was done in 2008, Betavi, my Taten's Stub, that is almost entirely in Yiddish, right? Even though he's not a Yiddish speaker, it's not his mother tongue, about fighting in the war of Holocaust refugees and survivors. Here's another picture from this. Maybe you can ask me about it in the Q&A at the end. Also with Binyamin Arshav, all of his poetry, both in Hebrew and in Yiddish. And maybe we're gonna end with this. This is a recent volume of the journal Ho, which is on Arabic and Yiddish literature as the two sisters of modern Hebrew poetry. Thank you very much.